I just wanted to start with a note that as a person who's coming from New York City or from NYU to McGill, that I am moving between the ancestral lands of various indigenous peoples, including the Lenape, as well as the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations, whose presence, amongst others, mark the territories between New York City and Montreal. And I think the recent discovery of the remains of indigenous peoples at residence schools in Canada, as well as I think more recently in the US, denote how, despite different reconciliation policies, even at the level of constitutional principles in places such as Canada, that settler colonialism is an ongoing dynamic, an ongoing event. I also speak as a Palestinian, and thus my personal sort of commitment to the importance of the historical awareness of indigenous exclusion, of dispossession and erasure, but also of the need to acknowledge indigenous peoples and indigenous rights, past, present, and future. So to say that it's a pleasure to be here is really kind of playing down how much this actually means on multiple different kinds of levels. And it was actually during the years that I was here at McGill that certainly my sense of adult political awareness or consciousness kind of occurred and was sustained. And it was in the hallways of places like the Arts Building and Leacock and McLennan and the Student Center, which I think at the time, I don't know if this has happened or not, but at the time there was these rumors that it was going to be called the William Shatner Student Center. I don't know if it's been called that or not, but at the time that's sort of what it was. In any case, it was also this sort of moment where there were different kind of political dynamics happening in and around Montreal. So at McGill, certainly there was the South Africa Committee's campaign to have McGill divest from any interest that it had in South African businesses. There was also, at the time that I was on campus, there was also the Gani Satake resistance that happened in terms of what was going on with Oka. It was also one of the heights, if you want, of Quebecois separatism. I mean, not the one of the 70s, but certainly the one of the 80s and the 90s. I remember when, suddenly Dorchester Boulevard became René Lévesque, right? And it was a sort of joke that the next thing was going to be anything called Elizabeth was also going to be called René Lévesque. But in any case, it was a sort of this kind of, for me, it felt like a kind of very sort of political moment. And that's just to describe what was happening at McGill in Montreal, whereas on a broader scale, other events in hindsight would really become formative. So economically, for example, the Canada-US trade agreement was signed, which would lead the way towards NAFTA. The collapse of the Soviet Union happened, and therefore kind of lead the way for what we come to know as the Washington Consensus on Economic Development. The Maastricht Treaty was signed at the time, which kind of forms the European Union. So there's a number of things that kind of seem to have happened at the time that really sort of at least informed my own way of kind of approaching the world. It was also the time where the beating of Rodney King and the acquittal of the 4 white police officers, which led to the LA riots, happened. And I mention that because it was also the sort of moment where the power of the image in making such sort of racist structures became sort of very palpable in a way that hadn't been apparent, at least to me, before that. Simultaneously, in Palestine, these were the very first years of the First Intifada. Which in my experience, again, at the time, where it's kind of meant 2 very different things. On the one hand, there was this very visible kind of aspect of the Intifada, and on the other, kind of much more invisible, but more economically, sociopolitically, and spatially powerful aspect. And the first was actually this video that was of the beating of these 2 cousins, Wael and Osama Joudeh, which was broadcast on Israeli TV back in 1988. And it was one of the first globally seen images of Israel's breaking bones policy. And it was filmed by a camera, CBS as in the American sort of CBS. It was filmed by an Israeli-American cameraman. And as Rebecca Stein notes in her new book called Screenshots, international media coverage at the time of the First Intifada was extensive, but it was really this blurry video from Nablus that was the first to kind of go viral, if you want, even though we didn't use those terms back then. It showed Wael and Osama, teenagers at the time, their arms behind their back, and being beaten by the 4 Israeli soldiers with stones, with their rocks, and so on. The soldiers are utterly focused on actually just sort of the beating as opposed to anything else. And in fact, one of the reporters at the time kind of declared on Israeli TV, the soldiers do not seem to be in any danger, nor do they seem disturbed by the events. They are utterly focused on meting out the beating. So the entirety of the footage, which is about half an hour, was never fully aired on Israeli TV, of course. Only a portion of it would be. And that was in part because of the orders of the Israeli Broadcasting Authority, who decided that the political damage would just be too great. But the video circulated widely within international media outlets. And it was this moment then that today perhaps seems a little bit more, a little bit more normal, if you want, today, in that we've become sort of more accustomed to seeing images, whether of Israeli violence meted on Palestinians or even of Palestinians trying to resist these. So I share these in the context in which we gather, which is in part to sort of deal with the visual chronicling of dispossession. Of course, it's a very different kind of image than the images that we see of the souks next door, but they equally speak to the political importance of images, photographs that are active in forming new approaches to political resistance and cultural production. The second part, though, of the Intifada, and this, again, I'm kind of reflecting back on the late 80s, early 90s, but the second part of the Intifada that for me was just as formative, but not at all visible, or not visible in the same way, was of the various kind of aspects of civil disobedience that marked the early days of the Intifada. It was really the general strikes, which I found kind of incredibly powerful at the time. So prior to the Intifada, Israel had worked on deepening Palestinian consumerism, aiming to prevent the saving of money so that it could actually be absorbed into the Israeli economy. And the advent of the Intifada kind of caused the reversal of some of this. Gradually, and not fully, of course, but merchants went on strike, markets shut down. Many Palestinian laborers who were working within the Green Line stopped going to work. They refused to go to work, and Israeli products were boycotted. And so while there's no denying the impact in the declining incomes and the economic hardships that this had on Palestinian families, the developments that I think happened during the first Intifada really sort of forced changes in Palestinian consumption and production, at least in their patterns. And so different forms of exchange and different kinds of market structures, if you will, emerged, such as communal cooperatives, which produced mechanisms that reflected a strategy of kind of economic resistance, aimed to strengthen Palestinian resilience and self-sufficiency. I can never say this word. Sufficiency. With the help of the unified national leadership of the uprisings, cooperatives emerged as one of the many tools of economic resistance. They developed, for example, the phenomenon of domestic economies, and the boycotting of Israeli products really sort of meant that businesses the boycotting of products and businesses led to the emergence of a sort of more nationally focused economy that was fueled by homegrown goods, increasing agricultural productivity, and so on. And so a different kind of economic dynamic began to emerge, one that was built on the importance of volunteerism and the need for commons, goods that were kind of accessible to all. And so that period of civil disobedience, of well-organized strikes, and of communal cooperatives was short-lived, and in no small part because of the very global shifts that I actually just mentioned earlier, which was sort of my own kind of political awakening. And so in the background of the Intifada, what was also happening with the Madrid talks, which eventually lead a few years later to the Oslo Peace Accords. So by the early 1990s, Palestinians were faced with the peace talks, which saw the formation of two very important shifts, which were the results of what was happening in the late 80s and the early 90s. And those legacies kind of continue to define the landscape today. On the one hand is the expansion of the state of Israel, and I mean that in a sort of very physical, spatial sense, through bypass roads, through highways, through settlements, through walls, checkpoints, permit regimes, and the list just goes on and on. But on the other hand, also the introduction and the expansion of a neoliberal capitalist regime, which really happens again at the end of the 80s and the early 90s. So if I started my time at McGill, Palestinians were kind of in the throes of the first Intifada. Demonstrations were taking place on the streets of Palestine. Civil disobedience also meant the shutting down of businesses and of markets. By the time I finished McGill, the Palestinian Authority was born in a form that is kind of largely the same as it is today. A government entity that hadn't previously existed would become, over the course of those following 30 years, increasingly indebted, both financially, but also indebted in terms of like its relationship to external funding and aid, and indebted more symbolically to a kind of different model of socio-political and economic policies that we call the Washington Consensus. So what we see over the course of those years is that at the same time, the images of Israeli violence against Palestinians were still exceptional, as in the video of the Judea prisons. By the time the early 90s come around, by the time the Oslo Accords are signed, we're also entering a kind of new age of global and digital media. So as communication technologies begin to proliferate across the globe, many activists in Palestine and obviously beyond kind of attach the political hopes to the ostensible promise of the power of photography, the power of media, the power eventually of digital technologies. So if the violence of colonial regimes is now more visible, maybe also social movements that would also be more visible. They would be represented and circulated beyond these different locations. So I bring these up not just because I am kind of going down memory lane, I can't help it, sort of walking around here, but I bring these up because I really think that these are the kind of three major sort of dynamics or shifts that happen that very much continue to inform certainly the way that I think about Palestine today, but that are still kind of, that are still sort of very much there, but in different kinds of convergences. I also bring these up because I kind of wanted to give a bit of a historical context to when and how these different economic, political, technological, mediatic, spatial formations that continue to shape Palestine, how they kind of took shape then. So these three dynamics of Israeli colonialism, of neoliberal or global capitalism, and of new communication technologies have obviously gotten more formidable over the past 30 years. But the question remains, as it did then, what exactly is the power of the image, and what is the possibility of an image to resist violent forces such as Israeli colonialism and global capitalism? Which brings me to kind of where we are today, and kind of thinking about Souq Stories, by which I mean both the exhibit, but also something else, which I'll explain in a sec. In a sense, I think Souq Stories sort of deals with this question of what is the power of the image and what is this relationship to resist different kinds of violences and forces. And in another way, or another way to say it would be, what is the relationship then between dispossession, the commons, and visual representation, which is what I'm hoping I'm going to kind of focus on the rest of today. So the exhibit itself, which if you haven't seen it, I do encourage you to go next door. The photographs, and the photographs of markets specifically, of people going, gathered and going about their daily activities in the spaces of markets, are themselves ways of exploring the idea of the commons, of demonstrating the importance of historic markets in Palestine as centers of cultural and economic heritage, as centers of civic life, and as social and political spaces that face existential challenges due to Israeli colonialism and capitalist forces. But what I'd like to do is also kind of think about Souq Stories not just simply as the exhibit, but also as this relationship between images and markets. And so during my time, I'd like to think about the convergence of capitalism and Israeli colonialism as they constrain and contain and enclose collective spaces, how they foreclose particular kinds of commons, how they engender infrastructures of exclusion, but yet at the same time recognize that both markets and images of markets, okay, or photographs of markets, are also ways to do more than just simply respond to the violence of those conditions, but they also denote the very demands of collective life and public assemblage. I think that what they do is that they show or they demonstrate or they perform themselves the right to urban space, the right to be present, and the right to be recognized. So Souq Stories, the exhibit, but also Souq Stories, the relation of images and markets, perform a politics of recognizability and create spaces of assertion. So I'm kind of giving you my conclusion from the beginning. But so we're going to talk about enclosures and commons, and then I'll touch on souqs, and then touch on photography, and then argue that what we're experiencing or what we see here is something that I would call the photography of the commons. So I'll briefly kind of start with the commons and enclosure. Palestinian markets, okay, the ones that we see in the photographs, exist in this context of Israeli colonialism and global capitalism, these two forces of enclosure. And here I mean enclosure in this kind of historical economic sense, in that which forecloses the commons. So I'll briefly kind of expand. Enclosure is a historically, geographically, economically specific process that evolves as part of the Industrial Revolution in 18th century Great Britain, which actively transforms a territorial space's social economy, demography, and culture. There were different kinds of elements to how enclosures worked. Some were legal in the way that property was redefined, and property rights were redefined by reorganizing systems of ownership, systems of use, as well as of circulation. There were also architectural elements, such as hedges and walls and fences and gates. So this combination of legal and architectural articulations kind of resulted in these new enclosed spaces that enforced a different kind of system of circulation, a system of flow, and a different system of flow. So parts of the social and economic life that were formerly common, non-commodified formerly, and largely outside of the realm of control and surveillance, were suddenly turned, not suddenly, but were turned into private and surveillable possessions under a new property regime that sought to limit free mobility. And by free, I mean both like sovereign, but also not uniform. So the enclosure of Palestine, I think, is important to understand that the enclosure of Palestine, and thus its markets, is to really be understood as part of the production of a particular kind of economic space. Palestine's economic landscape is not simply unevenly developed, but entirely de-developed, as Sarah Roy would have it. It is besieged by Israel. It is almost entirely dependent on external aid and foreign debts. It is drowning in poverty. If, for example, the PA did not exist when I graduated McGill, today's PA is about $5 billion in debt. Right? It's pretty astronomical speed of debt. But it's also, the Palestinian space is also defined by policies of neoliberal capitalism. The starting point, of course, for talking about enclosure and commons is, of course, none other than Marx, and in particular, the part of capital that's called the so-called primitive accumulation. And it's obviously one of Marx's greatest insights to understand that this was nothing short of the historical process of separating the product from the means of production. In other words, I think what's important to kind of understand here is that the actual historical process of accumulation was and continues to be a process of class composition in which private property is constituted by the separation of the direct producers, obviously from the means of production, but that is to say, in a different way, of the dispossession of the masses. So additionally, you can also think of the work of people like Henri Lefebvre or David Harvey, who've shown how the spread of neoliberal capitalism and dispossession have been a dynamic that exists throughout circuits of capital, resulting in uneven spatial and economic development. So in the economic sense, the key feature of capitalism has been the transformation of the common goods into private property and into commodities themselves. One way to see this is through the extent to which various infrastructures, for example, such as roads, electricity, mobilities, telecommunications, and all sorts of others, have become kind of both privatized, but also sort of more and more open to surveillance. Have also become kind of these multifaceted processes by which there is profit being made, but then there's also different kinds of architectural forms of enclosure that happen. So what you have in a context such as Palestine is you have Palestinian and multinational corporations. You have the Palestinian Authority, you have international non-governmental organizations, you have international capital networks, combined to lead the kind of development of the state and its various infrastructures to follow this very neoliberal economic agenda, largely defined by the Washington Consensus Development Model, which is really another way of saying economic enclosure. But bless you. And the combination of that with the Oslo Accords, or we can think of the Oslo Accords as sort of forming a kind of legal elements of enclosure. But over the past 30 years, if not, of course, sort of much longer, what you also have is a different kind of enclosure and dispossession that is happening, which is the dispossession at the hands of the Israeli state. Its most visible form, of course, is that which happens on the land. And this is true of enclosure as much economically as much as it is in terms of settler colonial rights. So the annexation of land, the dispossession of Palestinians from their lands, from their rural and urban spaces. Palestinians have also become more contained and enclosed by walls, by checkpoints, by permits, by aerial drones, and so on. So these are, in a sense, the kind of architectural elements of enclosure. So enclosures are really means by which spatialities of inclusion and exclusion operate across these different logics of neoliberal restructuring, of different kinds of legal frameworks, of military violence, and of modes of manipulation and exploitation at various scales. And so even though enclosures have largely referred to land, I think land is just a sort of particularly vivid trope for a much more extensive appropriation of resources that were once held in common. So it's not simply a process of fencing off common land. It's actually a multifaceted sort of process. So when I refer to the commons, I don't just simply mean the green fields that we used to once upon a time share together in Great Britain, but all of these different facets. So on the one hand, the commons, yes, are the earth and the natural resources to which all people should have equal access. But the commons are also the institutions and infrastructures that provide things like healthcare, education, housing, welfare for all, as well as broadcasting, telecommunications, internet connections, and so on. But the commons are also the rural and the urban spaces where humans communicate, where they cooperate, where they interact socially and culturally. The commons are also the physical products that are commonly produced largely by cooperative work, but you can also think of those as commons. It's, again, not just simply land. And finally, the commons are also what Antonio Negri and Michael Hart call the social commons, which are the codes, the images, the ideas, the information, the products of the biopolitical economy, which include affects and social relationships, which I'll come back to that in a second, but this is where photography emerges as an example of the commons. So until the late 80s, early 1990s, Palestinians have been faced with this expansion of the State of Israel, as well as the expansion of this neoliberal capitalist regime across Palestine and across different aspects of it. This expansion has been very much territorial and spatial, as well as economic and political. So over the past 30 years, Palestinians have been seeing these sort of new and varying forms of enclosures of their different kinds of commons. So the souqs that we see and observe in the photographs are themselves actually enclosed. They are contained themselves by the forces of Israeli colonialism and global capital. they are more impacted, or they're kind of more like victims of these than they are leaders or makers of that kind of logic. Of course, they are markets themselves, so I don't mean that. I don't mean market just simply as a space where things are being traded, but when I say a neoliberal global market logic, I mean a neoliberal global market logic, right? It's quite different. But so understood against the context of the enclosures I just described, souks and the local markets that we see are spaces that seek and work to withstand the vagaries of settler colonialism and capitalism. They perform and enact certain political functions. They have spatial forms, they create space, and they function spatially. So as we see in the different cities and the different markets in the pictures, there are different kinds of markets. They take obviously sort of very different forms. Some are permanent, some are seasonal, some are central, some are local, some provide kind of large scale sort of trading structures that provide, that have international products. Some are there more on a daily basis for the selling of particular fruits or fish. Some have open air settings, others don't. Some kind of harken back to their early forms as caravanseries, supporting the flow of commerce and information and people across different networks of trade routes. Some are set up more like kind of what you'd imagine the bazaar to be set up, where street vendors are kind of lined up in parallel tents and stalls. So historically, regardless though, historically markets work in close relationship to city walls, to gates, to mosques, to churches, where vendors always benefit from the flow of local populations. You can also kind of think of markets as in the reverse. They also emerge where forms of people kind of gather. Such as increasingly around places like checkpoints or even tunnels. So markets are both where people congregate, but markets are also from where people congregate. So this means that markets or souks share a number of different aspects that are kind of important to highlight. One is that markets are centralizing spaces, places where people gather, where they commune, where they partake in trade, right? They are places where they integrate different kinds of residents together. They also serve a very spatial function in that they're very local. They happen in place. People must come to them physically. They have to be present in them in order for the market to actually work. So markets are locally produced. They emerge at specific crossroads in particular towns, while have also played an important historical aspect in creating those towns. So I think of a city like Jericho, which is often sort of famed as like the oldest, most inhabited city in the world, right? Something like 10,000 years ago. Or it has been continuously inhabited for the past 10,000 years, right? I would venture to say that the market in Jericho is also then 10,000 years old, right? And then these things kind of come together. So markets arise, of course, out of economic needs, but they also create different kinds of economic needs. So there are modes and means of interchange and expression of the collective. But markets are also very much embedded in city spaces. They're made of vernacular materials. So if you were to look at the images, I was having a very brief chat with Diane earlier, right? It's like, well, can you tell which markets are which, right? And I couldn't sort of tell as much, but I think, I don't know, I'm gonna guess, but she looks at the ground, and she's like, okay, well, that's Akka, or that's, I can't remember what the other one that you mentioned was. It was something else. Hebron, right? I was like, oh, so she kind of recognizes, right? So each market has its own kind of architecture, its own sort of vernacular touch, right? The stones are sort of different, the colors are different, so they're very local and they're very embedded in that particular way. They're also, they also are ways to kind of link different urban spaces to each other, like mosques, churches, hammams, and all sorts of other places as well. So they're kind of this complex, organic, sometimes linear structure and that you walk right through, but they are nonetheless a kind of a part of the sort of urban vitality and of different kind of urban and social values. And in doing that, they only attract even more human interaction and human forms of communication. So what that means is that souqs are also where publics come together. Public spaces are obviously identified as the shared spaces where social activities take place. And even if in the market some of this relates to shopping, it's still a kind of social activity. So people share a common ground, kind of literally and figuratively, in the market. A market is also where there is a concentration of different kinds of interchanges, where there are relations and connections between people and where those become actually possible, right, because of the ability of being together. So the souq is a marketplace, as in, like, I sort of see them as somewhat separate words, right? As in, it's also this very kind of physical aspect, but it equally functions as a kind of regulator of commercial activities and trade circulation. It's where strangers come together to interact, and it's also inevitably where different patterns of conduct also emerge, right? So you learn how to behave in a market, whether you haggle or whether you share a cup of tea or whatever else you might be doing while you're shopping, okay? So they provide these crucial spaces of interaction and possibility. In all cases, though, markets also function as hubs or nodes in a network. They serve as points of connection of different trade routes, of different locations. They serve as connections between different people and different goods, right? Between whether it's different merchants or even sort of different cosmopolitan tastes, for example. So markets are local, but they're also quite kind of networked in the sense of they are centers within a much wider system of circulation of goods and people. As such, they also accommodate a wide range of users, because it's not just simply the people who shop who kind of make markets, but there's different needs, different requirements, and different expectations of what happens in the market. So they serve to connect, is another way to sort of put it. And by doing that, I kind of see markets as very much a sort of social emergent that has this very purposive social complexity. Markets kind of tell stories themselves. They tell the stories of human drama, of a mark in time. They are, in a sense, kind of a conscious work of art. Markets are also, they've historically also been and continue to be cultural and social spaces. And I think they hold very important kind of political and economic and cultural functions. And I can sort of deal with this later, but I was thinking about it in the context, for example, of how malls are ways of displacing, shopping malls, right, or e-shopping even, are ways of displacing markets, which is why you might see these happening in places like the Gulf. And that it's a way of actually weakening the very political functions that markets have. But I can sort of talk about that later. So all of these different ways in which I've tried to define what a market does, or the sort of importance of market, that they are centralizing spaces, that they're embedded in local spaces, that they form a part of urban vitality, that they promote human interaction, that they're public, or they're a means at least where the public comes together, that they form relations and connections between people, that they are themselves hubs and in a network, nodes in a network. I could equally be saying about photographs, right? So this is another way perhaps of describing what a photograph also does. So the photographs in the exhibit, I think, are significant because they really speak to how the visual component asserts political agency in the face of diminishing resources, in the face of diminishing prospects, and an increasingly precarious economic existence. So the photographs, yes, respond to the violence at hand, but they also address the performative possibilities that are enacted through the presence of Palestinians in space and its visualizations on several different levels. First, in terms of like the subjects of photography, perhaps more than any other medium, photography has taken sort of collective everyday life as its key subject. Photography is all about the kind of colloquial, everyday public space. Unlike other forms of image making, such as paintings or film, photography is usually, or historically certainly, is rife with representations of people, and specifically people on streets, as collectives, as crowds, in public spaces, in everyday contexts. People going about their everyday normal practices is itself a marker of collective life. So these photographs next door demonstrate the quotidian resilience of a systematically oppressed community that prevails despite settler colonial displacement and disenfranchisement. Second, it's also important to think about how these photographs function. They are, of course, venues for historical context and memory. As images, they sort of testify to the attachment. They testify to the attachment to spatiality in urban spaces, ways in which spaces are local and networked. That even despite being severed by the occupation, despite that they can, what they show is a sort of continued presence on land or in urban spaces, right? So they're a way of keeping the claims of Palestinian ownership and belonging alive and visible. The photographs that depict the old souks illuminate the displacement and reveal an artifact of a past life that continues its existence in a different form. So the memory through which figurations and the experiences that underlie them attest to both prior and continued relationships to the land, to urban space, and to different forms of property and different forms of sort of ownership, not just simply deeds and titles or whatever is sitting in Israeli archives, but as something else as well. So we can also see that photography can fulfill a kind of a crucial critical function in refusing the ideologies of elimination. And so they constitute a form of knowledge that presents us with an alternative political imaginary, ones in which the affective and emotional consequences of displacement can be addressed and dealt with in some fashion. So photographs are also, though, what I think of as like sort of tears in a temporal continuum. They are themselves a temporal practice that result in an immobile object, which, because it's made over time and of time, invites us to kind of spend time contemplating it. So photography represents time, not only by recording it and making it endure, but also by producing a kind of spot where this immediate moment is no longer just forgotten, but it's also there for us to revisit and to continue into the future. So to look into any one of these photos is to recognize the potential and the obligation that we also have as viewers looking into the market. So the unique capacity of photographic images is to picture not just what is the case, but what the potential of the represented to become other than what it was, since that which has already happened in the moment when the scene in front of the lens became an image, that is, something utterly different. Photographs don't just image the world as it is, but they're also the moment of its becoming otherwise. They show the world as it might or could be, or should have been, or could become. Photographs, in other words, are subjunctive, right? They make visible what is imagined or wished or possible. Perhaps a lot more eloquently, this is how Walter Benjamin would say it, that no matter how artful the photographer, no matter how carefully posed his subject, the beholder feels an irresistible urge to search such a picture for the tiny spark of contingency, of the here and now with which reality has, so to speak, seared the subject to find the inconspicuous spot where the immediacy of that long-forgotten moment, the future nests so eloquently that we, looking back, may rediscover it. So the photograph has this indexical kind of capacity or documentary ambiguity, and it's unique in terms of its relationship to other visual forms or other media, in this ability to kind of mitigate this gap between the moment that is taken and the retelling of that moment, right? Between the narrator or the photographer or the merchant in this case, and us as the viewers. So the Souq Stories collect and create these photographic images that entwine these different complex Palestinian publics. They bring together their stories, their voices, their traumas, their triumphs that are too often kind of unheard and unseen. They are new documentary modes of photographing Palestine. They are producing images that reconcile a contested past, because it's kind of still there. They're ways of producing images of the troubled present as well as the possible future. So these photographs kind of create a space for imagining of how life could be otherwise, working against property relations and against settler colonialism. The question of Palestine has always been a question of recovering absence. Whether it's the loss of sovereignty after 48, whether it's a dispossession of the land that followed, the setbacks of 76, or the setbacks since even the peace accords, there's always been this kind of question of absence even before the invention of photography. But in the absence of presence, the camera, the photograph, at the hands of these different photographers, as the ones that we're with today, the photographs are perhaps kind of amelioration of an inescapable absence that is inherent to Palestinian life under colonial occupation. As Eduardo Cordova states, there can be neither truth nor photography without ashes. Like allegory, both take place only in a state of decay, in a state that moves away from itself in order to be what it is. Like the photograph that tells us what is no longer before us, truth can only be read, if it can be read at all, in the traces of what is no longer present. So photographing absence has the transformative potential of photographing what has remained largely invisible outside of Palestine or outside of the occupied territories. So another way to put that is that the images themselves are a way to move on behalf of the people who themselves cannot move. These photographs then link different communities. They themselves work not just simply as witnesses, but they also themselves work as webs of relations, or as webs of social relations. So what I'd like to argue is that these photographs that we've seen, or that we will see hopefully, are really a space of appearance, and that they bring together a few different arguments. One is Jacques Rancière's distribution of the sensible in terms of what is visible and to whom. Judith Butler's argument of the right to appear, which emerges as one of the demands of publicly assembled bodies, and Henri Lefebvre's right to the city as a co-created space, a space for life detached from the growing effects of commodification and capitalism. So the ability to appear is itself a matter of one's presence and one's legibility. Appearance hinges on being there in space. It hinges on being recognized, on being witnessed, or being seen by others. So what the three authors at least sort of bring or make possible for us to see is sort of give us the tools to think through photographs of markets as powerful and politically able to usurp the very regimes of truth and representations that so far Palestinians have had to sort of live in. The Souq stories are a politics, in the sense that a politics in itself is a delimitation of spaces and times, of the visible and of the invisible, that simultaneously determines the place and the stakes of politics as a form of experience. Politics revolves around what can be seen and what can be said about it, around who has the ability to see and the talent to speak or the talent to photograph, and around the properties of spaces and the possibilities of time. Politics is the space created when the dominant status quo is challenged and is struggled against. The moment of politics is the moment where these possibilities happen. So the photographs that we have do not simply depict or represent a form of resistance or activism themselves. They are themselves inextricably bound up in political discourses. The activist capacity of photographs can be understood to belong to the photography of the commons. Photographs, and particularly in their various contemporary forms, fall into both material and immaterial categories. As I mentioned earlier, Hart and Negri's conception of the commons includes the social commons, the codes, the images, the ideas, the information, the product of the biopolitical economy, which includes knowledge, affect, information, and social relationships. They also assert that attempting to force exclusive ownership rights, wrangling these products or these forces into private capitalist relations of property, ultimately reduces the productivity and benefit. So the way that photographs blur the barriers of materiality and are available for us beyond mere production and consumption means that they are actually poised to harness the commons and to be deployed in formations that resist forces of privatization, colonization, and depoliticization. Collections of images constitute spaces of resistance and perform a kind of recognizability that is often denied in broader public spheres. And here I mean the public sphere is dominated and curtailed both by Israeli colonialism and capital neoliberalism. So the photograph is a common space, or the commons is also a photographic space. So the images that emerge as their own political and visual language, that is to some degree outside of mediation, enact their own form of resistance and generative politics. They carve out a space. To construct the commons in response to the increasingly constrained public sphere and the right to public space, by privileging particular images, the makers, and the narratives that are otherwise included, and disseminating them beyond the purviews of conventional organizations like museums, newscasters, and so on. These images construct new means of conversation and propagation of imagery. So the space of appearance is the emergence of a new public sphere, one that responds to the shrinking opportunities to engage in public and the broader culture. These images are making demands upon society to be recognized and to be witnessed, just as assembled bodies do. So us as viewers have a particular opportunity to apprehend the images as testimonial documents, to participate through witnessing their work of constituting a photographic commons. The political capacity in proliferating images in public space very much hinges on the recognition and visibility in order to eke out a space in which things can be witnessed. As a result, viewers can participate in the movement of the image from representative object to a political process. So existing publicly itself, Souq Stories, becomes an embodied form of protest. As Butler suggests, the body in public is a political act. By physically occupying a space that it claims, the body in turn embodies that claim. As physical public space is diminished and the state disallows certain bodies to move through that space, the concept of the commons is tasked with reasserting itself both in physical and spatial sense, as well as in its affective, qualitative dimensions, such as through photography. So the photography of the commons suggests a new form of political solidarity, premised on the image as performative and constitutive of public spheres. Souq Stories, then, are where Palestinians practice their right to be recognized, where Palestinians perform and practice their right to appearance, their right to be, their right to public assemblage, and their right to collective life. They denote some of the demands of collective life and public assemblage as well: the right to urban space, the right to be present, and the right to be recognized. And as photographs sitting here in Montreal and McGill, Souq Stories perform a broader transnational, mobile, and global recognizability. Thank you.
So now what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go back in time, and we have the curators of the original Souq Stories exhibition with us today. So we have Leanne and Amir and Wyatt and Amir and Rita, who are going to talk a little bit about different aspects of that exhibition, how they put it together, the ideas that sort of informed it. And then hopefully we'll have time at the end for any questions you might have. So I thought maybe we could begin with you, Amir, and whether you could sort of tell us a little bit about how the idea for the project came about and also the concepts that motivated it.
Sure. Can you hear me like this? Okay. So thank you everybody for coming. Thank you for the beautiful talk. I want to begin by saying that we represent a very large group of volunteers and people that made this project possible, and that we're here representing the people that are driven by a sense of duty and love for their homeland. So please look at the film that we prepared for you, look at the book, really read about them, learn about them. We really appreciate that. So this project is, unprecedented in many ways, and it entailed a lot of work and difficulties to bring it to life. And as my colleagues will talk and show in their presentations, however, I want to start us off with is the underlying logic to which we conceptualized the project. We envisioned it more from the anthropological perspective, underlying it. I think Leanne will talk more about the architectural conceptualization behind it. So first and foremost, the exhibition highlights the struggle for a Palestinian selfhood, a national belonging grounded in history, space, and socio-cultural relations. Palestinians are not only not recognized as a people by the settler colonial state and many nation states around the world, but also the forces of colonial dispossession, along with the forces of the global capitalist market, have constantly targeted, uprooted, and fragmented the common infrastructures that participate in the makeup of Palestinian peoplehood. Despite all this, however, Palestinians are still a people. You see, under the daily reality of uprootedness enforced by geodemographic colonial engineering, there exists as well a daily practice of resistance. For every act of uprooting, there is an act of rerouting. For every act of dismemberance, there's an act of remembrance. For every act of fragmentation, there's an act of reunification. So these practices incarnate in collective political acts of resistance that transcend colonial divisions, just as we saw in the uprising of dignity, which took place last year in May, but also in the daily practices of Palestinians, which construct a meaningfully and sensorially experienced code of a collective being. It is precisely within this space between uprooting and rerouting that the dialectical collective Palestinian experience exists and exerts meaning into the world. It is this experience and the way it incarnates in our project which makes this Souq Stories exhibition fundamentally Palestinian. Within the Souq and in every place in Palestine, there is a commonality of being that is working to rebuild itself under a regime that is constantly working towards its undoing and our unbeing. The Palestinian Souq harbors a kind of sovereignty that parallels that of the nation state, one that is based on a rooted continuity of space, social encounter, economic exchange, civic experience, historically entrenched yet accumulative, continuously impaired yet constantly repaired. Ultimately, the Souq serves as a testament to our dynamic oneness. So the exhibition aims to highlight and empower these mundane daily practices and experiences that take place in the Souq as a means to reweave the different parts of our being that have been epistemologically and ontologically unmoved by colonialism. While doing so, we had three intersecting aims driving our project. The first is boosting the national economy through attracting people to 7 historical local souks. Second aim was empowering youth across colonial borders by bringing together hundreds of young volunteers, academic photographers, curators, and 14 organizations into one organizational structure. And third, strengthening the sense of oneness among Palestinians by establishing a multi-sided simultaneous exhibition where the public spaces of the Souq themselves became a gallery of the unified Palestinian self. So in 7 cities, for 7 days, these photographs were exhibited in the public alleyways and communal spaces of the Souqs, along with more than 100 cultural, musical, performative, and educational activities. So the conceptual logic behind this approach lies in anthropology as a mode of imagination, because this project was introduced by Insaniyat Anthropology in the Community Committee, which aimed at making anthropological knowledge accessible to the public. And at the heart of anthropology, as I understand it, is the idea that within what is recognized as other, there lies also the self and its various possibilities. There's always a difference about the other, but a kind of communality and a universality of sorts. This notion receives particular meaning in the Palestinian context, where selfhood is being constantly signified by colonial classifications. It's precisely through the colonial control of space and geography where Palestinians dispersed across different geopolitical lines begin to see each other as others. So here, photography serves to weaponize what Saint Haj calls the radical anthropological imagination through photography, where Palestinians were able to interact with the images in their own context and reflect back on their own selves, their own uniqueness that makes them distinct, and the overarching narrative that brings them together. The hope was for Palestinians to recognize their own selves in the other under the heterogeneous totality of us that the Souq harbors. Transcending divisions and emphasizing our oneness as a people within one homeland also meant creating organizational structures that navigated the common and uncommon infrastructures of mobility, of economy, and of institutional regulations, and within that process, to face the challenge of unity together in a challenge that itself is unifying. One last point I want to make is that clearly this project was made by Palestinians for Palestinians. Through it, we reflected back on ourselves through questions like, what does it mean to be Palestinian? How do we draw a unifying Palestinian narrative that sprouts from the ground up? And how do we make everyday Palestinians participate in the weaving of this narrative together while living under geographic divisions, economic deprivation, and dispossession? But I was grappling with the meaning of us presenting the exhibition for a Western crowd in a different central colony, where the same acts of erasure of natives is also being enacted, but more generally to a non-Palestinian crowd. Because the Souq, as a site of rooted continuity, inspires for us as Palestinians a particular will to be Palestinian, but what else can it inspire to others? So I think that's a question for you to answer, but I also think that despite the particularity of this experience, there is a universal dimension to it that poses the world with a lot of fundamental questions, like what does it mean to be a community? How does a community exist as a community when power structures work towards its undoing? How do the architectural, sensorial, historical, and human elements that make up the public space participate in the constitution of a being unmediated by power structures? How does public space not only produce units of identity and collective narrative, but also cultivate a common will for a common destiny? It is here that I believe that the exhibition helps us see how the question of Palestine is also a human question. It is, I hope, a window through which the world can reflect back on itself in its struggle for genuine liberation, equality, and unity. Thank you.
Thanks. We gathered in the School of Architecture, and we have an architect, a Palestinian architect, with us here today. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak to the kind of your experience of working on these questions of planning and development and spatial politics, and how you see this exhibition as kind of intervening in those spatial politics.
Can you hear me now? Hold it. Okay. Thank you for being here. The Souq, being the old historic Palestinian cities, means that it's a very important component of the built heritage in the space, which, as mentioned before, it included all the public encounters, economic exchange, and so on. So being part of this built heritage means that it is also connected to the collective identity and the collective narrative of Palestinians, of us. These everyday practices of social encounters and public encounters made it being absorbed for us as being like a narrative from our parents and so on, being absorbed as a self-managed public space, as a common resource, as it was for hundreds of years and so on. So nowadays, this space or this built heritage is being threatened by multiple suppressive mechanisms of the settler colonial state in terms of planning and multiple means. So these mechanisms actually take form in each city differently, but they are all rooted in the same law system and in the same agenda. Starting from the 1948, the first mechanism is the destruction machine, which were like in 1948 in the Nakba, hundreds of Palestinian villages and towns were leveled down to the ground, and until now, in warfare times, in multiple nationally contested places such as Gaza, and Nablus, were being these old historic fabrics are being targeted by military assault and so on. So these public spaces that once acted and functioned as public spaces, let's say in Khalil, in Hebron, now they are being absorbed as militarized spaces in which bring the public life of Palestinians into the private spaces. The other mechanism is the building appropriation by the system of law that legitimizes this appropriation and stealing of the properties actually. So what happens in Jerusalem, let's say, the practice is the work of archaeology that happens in the old historic fabric of the cities, in which it brings with it all the claims of properties underground and upground. So this mechanism not just only changes the meaning of the space, but also appropriates it. The other mechanism is, which is like the same places. So in Jaffa, let's say, the Palestinian population was replaced after the Nakba by the Jewish settlers. That today it's being used, this marketplace or these old cities are being used as artistic villages or artistic places in order to profit the neoliberal agenda and the free market. So that before that they have seen these old cities and old fabrics as a failure of the market that can't be developed and growth. So bringing these artists into this urban fabric has really changed the local identity and the local history of the space and its public life in it. The last strategy that I will be talking about, and of course there are multiple strategies, the last one is the modern planning strategies and means of the new branches that started extending outside the old cities that have started in the late Ottoman era. And in the British era, they started seeing these old cities as a museum, like a museumification of this place, not as we observed as a public and encountering, different classes and different, encounters and so on. So this museumification has led to seeing them as not livable spaces, and these strategies continued in the Israeli settler colonial state, in which it sees actually, let's say, in Akka and in Nazareth, let's say in Akka, so these new public spaces and modern spaces that have been created, they actually are public spaces of representing the rulers, the authority, and not representing the local population of the space and so on. The result is of all of these that nowadays the old cities population is being marginalized, and it's hosting low-income families, and because of these strategies, and it has very inadequate infrastructures and so on. The other thing is that spatially the old cities has always been separated from the urban fabric spatially, and like spatial barriers, behavioral barriers, and legal barriers between the old cities themselves and the newly urban planned or unplanned actually modern spaces. So at the end, I'll say a word about what the Souq Story Exhibition tried to set the path to is actually seeing these spaces as probably liberated spaces in means of trying to decolonize our perception of these obstacles or putting them aside to decentralize them, and then looking at the souks as a place where resistant economy can be implied, and where this common resource can be actually reappropriated again towards setting an infrastructure to be the basis for our self-determination.
Thank you so much. Now we're going to turn to Wyatt. So nice to see you, Wyatt. I'm so sorry you're not here with us. Really sad. And thank you so much for staying up, because I know it's very late where you are now. So thank you. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about sort of behind the scenes, how this project was implemented, and kind of how it was put together, some of the conceptual framework. But it'd be great if you could tell us a little bit about how
Of course. Thank you so much. Is the voice clear? All good? Okay, cool. Thank you again so much, Yana, everyone. It's such an honor to be here. And I know Amir Marshi has already said this, but let me start off by thanking, but also taking a moment to acknowledge the army of people who've been behind this project, but weren't able to be here today. And this team included academics, designers, web designers, writers, researchers, editors, translators, artists, photographers, journalists, and many more creatives. And I just want to take this moment to kind of appreciate those who are here, but also those who couldn't be here again. Moving forward, since my colleagues Layan and Amir framed the project theoretically, we thought the rest of us would kind of dig a little deeper into the nitty-gritty of the project and how we translated it from a concept on paper to a reality on the ground. So I'll start off by talking a little bit about the photography and curation groups, which I was one of the coordinators for, and talk a bit more about this network of existence that was created. And then hopefully my colleagues Amir Qaadan and Rita will focus more on the different challenges we came across and the journey, physical and beyond, that the project took on. The project had a number of groups or committees that were formed along the way. They included the photography group or groups, the curation group, the partners groups, the media group, and so on. When forming these groups, just like the concept of the project, they included members from all over Palestine. In addition to the photography group or groups, when recruiting members, we wanted individuals that had a passion for photography, but did not have the capacity or space to dig deeper into it. And also wanted people with deeper connections to the place they were documenting. In this case, it was each market. So we looked for 2 or 3 photographers from each city of the exhibition markets, and with them, we tried to find each person's vision and connection to the city. And throughout our weekly and monthly meetings and individual sessions, we worked on building the story for each and everyone, however they liked to share it, but also how it fell under the broader concept of the Souq Stories project. To explain better, I'd like to tell you about some of our photographers and how interpersonal interactions and relations made this exhibition richer. But before then, let me explain real quick that we ended up having 2 groups of photography and not one. The first one was our core group of photographers from the different cities, and they were approximately 13. And they accompanied us from the beginning of the project until the end. And then we ended up having an open call for more photographers to send in their pictures, to add more to the narrative. And this gave the chance to Palestinians who were outside of Palestine, but with access to it, to also be part of the journey. And they were also approximately between 13 and 14. So back to photographers, and for lack of time and maybe like afterwards, or Layan and Marshi could maybe discuss this like when you go to the exhibition itself. I'll speak for now about one of the photographers as an example. And his name is Mustafa Al-Kharouf from Jerusalem. Mustafa is a 30-something Jerusalemite. He was born to an Algerian mother and a Palestinian Jerusalemite father in Algeria and came back to Palestine with his family when he was 8. Since then, his journey with statelessness has started. Until this very day, Mustafa does not have any form of official identification papers. He's unable to travel, unable to get health insurance, unable to get driver license, and the list goes on and on. This is due to racist Israeli policies when it comes to what's being referred to as mixed Palestinian families, where one parent is Palestinian and the other is not. They or their kids end up getting sucked into these draconian, endless mazes of paperwork. And between courts and lawsuits, Mustafa is still being treated as an illegal migrant in his homeland. At one point, he was even imprisoned for over 100 days in a detention center for what they refer to as illegal migrants. And these are their words, not mine. Due to this, which he called his blessing and a curse, Jerusalem became the only home he knew. He could not really leave it because of fear of being caught, so coming across checkpoints was not an option. And he was always worried to go to other cities in fear of flying checkpoints, these random checkpoints in other words, or being caught on the intricate surveillance system that Israel has throughout the area. All of this was reflected in his photography. For instance, one of his pictures is of an old man with an arched back walking alone in the old city of Jerusalem at night where it's only himself, the moonlight, and the old city path. In a discussion with Mustafa after the exhibition, when he came in and saw it on the wall, he told me how much he sees himself in this photo, walking in these familiar streets, but with what feels like the weight of the world and going through sensations of familiarity, but still feels this sense of loneliness in the world. How he felt so at home, but so far away at the same time. Or as he's put it also, he was feeling this sense of exile in a homeland that no longer feels his, even though it's all he's ever known. And now every time I see this picture, I think of Mustafa and many like him, who Israel has turned their life in their homeland to life of exile, for instance. And that's why this exhibition, as my colleagues have said, and also as what Professor Helga has said as well, it's not detached from the day-to-day Palestinian reality, and it's not a separate event, it's a continuation. And we've had our exhibition openings happen post the April-May uprisings or Intifada in 2021, and post the latest deadly aggression on the Gaza Strip. That was when we stopped being virtual beings to each other and we ended up on the streets together. At that time, we ended up seeing so many people whom I haven't met because of COVID restrictions and everything in the streets, out in the streets with me. Even in one of the events that took place, one of them, of the photography team, he literally threw down, he put his camera to the side and stopped documenting the events that were taking place and kind of helped literally rescue me like from the arms of the Israeli forces at the time. Then when it was the war on the Gaza Strip, though we could not be there physically with our colleagues and people, we were communicating with them wherever we could. And these coordination WhatsApp groups we've had to plan meetings and share questions and so on have become our only source of solace and comfort whenever we heard back from our colleagues in Gaza confirming to us that they were actually still alive and well. So if you want to summarize the success, and I'm using this word for lack of words, it's past midnight here, of this project, it was not just the physical presence of the exhibitions and all of the activities surrounding it, even though they were extremely tremendous. But it was, in fact, this network of people that was created where this whole sense of Palestinian unity was not mere slogans or Zoom meetings, but it was actual unity that manifested beautifully throughout the period of the project until this very day, where the separation and division that was implemented through Israeli policies, rules, laws, and physical barriers that worked so hard on segregating and dividing us into these brutal domains of control have been crushed, have been shattered. I mean, yes, Israeli checkpoints are still there. Yes, the racist policies are still there. And we are still living under a brutal apartheid regime. And we are still suffering from settler colonialism. But in reality, none of this stops us being this united front of Palestinians from all over Palestine, including those in diaspora. And that is the true beauty of this project, or at least one of the many. After now this rosy image, I'll leave it back to Diana and to Qa'dan and Rita to kind of give a deeper eye maybe on the obstacles we face and bring it into the theoretical framework that we just discussed. Thank you.
I'm conscious that we're kind of closing in here, and I would like to leave a little bit of time for Q&A, but Amir, maybe you could talk a little bit more about the challenges of installing these exhibitions during the uprising, how the kind of fragmentation of space shaped the project on the ground, and sort of how you dealt with the difficulty of moving between cities.
Of course. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and a warm thank you for the audience for showing up and for being interested in our project. Secondly, in order to understand how the fragmentation of space shaped the implementation of the project, we first have to understand the physical layout of the space and how it's divided. And we have also to understand the consequences on the daily basis of the Palestinian people because of such division. So in order to get a bigger picture and understanding of the situation, the Palestinian nation is divided into 4 different geographical areas. And each part of the Palestinian people is given or granted a different ID card. The first is the Jerusalem ID card, which is basically gives you only freedom to move inside Jerusalem, and you'd also need a special military clearance and permission in order to go out. The second is the Gaza Strip ID card, which is also considered to be Gaza is considered to be the largest open air prison in the world. The third is the West Bank ID card, the green card, which only gives you a freedom of movement inside the West Bank. And the fourth is we call it the blue card, or the Israeli citizenship, which is given to Palestinians living inside the green line. However, each of these cards have a limitation and on the freedom of movement. And basically what that means is that the navigation through this system of separation is very difficult because, of course, as you know, our project, the Souq Story, is open in 6 different Palestinian cities: in Nazareth, in Jaffa, in Jerusalem, in Gaza, and in Khalil, and of course in Nablus. So what that means is that only the members that do have the blue card can access only 5 cities of the 6, and what that made is it's very difficult to meet, first of all. And for example, until now there wasn't any moment where all the members of the group had met, which is, I believe, it's very sad in itself. Furthermore, for example, when we wanted to take the components of the gallery, the pictures and the components itself, we had to get them from Ramallah. It was very difficult to get them to the other cities, which means that a normal trip between these cities normally takes 6-7 hours. However, our journey took us approximately around 48 hours, and that in itself shows how a very short distance can take a lot of time because of the separation tools, the physical separation tools, for example, the walls, the checkpoints, and so on and on. And another point is that the physical navigation in the space is very difficult, and an example for that is that there is many roads that are only allowed to be used by settlers or Israeli citizens, and there are roads only built to be used by the Palestinians. So the sense of not able to access and not able to reach part of our own people, our own towns, is in itself very difficult to deal with. However, like my fellow colleagues mentioned, a very important goal was to establish a sense of unity between the different groups and the Palestinian nation at all. And I really do hope that you can see this in the pictures and in the galleries. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amir. So, Rita, we conclude with you, and I was wondering if you could, as the assistant coordinator of this project, maybe you could kind of give us some reflections about what you feel the experience of working on the Souq Stories revealed about social, political, economic intersections in Palestinian society today?
Okay, thanks. And first of all, thanks for this opportunity. I think this is like a great one. And I don't have a lot to add after Amir, but maybe I could talk a little. Actually, in fact, describing the experience of the Souq Stories exhibition is challenging. I recall Layan calling to tell me about the Souq Stories project and asking if I want to get involved and assist, coordinate with partners, groups, and institutions. Little by little, I found myself becoming more involved in the project, and the tasks began to split and expand. As the exhibition approached and the problems became more apparent, what I learned and knew in the Souq Stories exhibition was mostly related to understanding the nature of the complexity in which we live as Palestinians, and an attempt to fragment Palestinians' reality at the levels of consequences, practices, lifestyle, and its expressions. So the Souq stories were not easy to experience, but the aim that we were trying to work on was to reattempt the concept of the Souq as Palestinians and to dismantle the colonial division to connecting the Palestinians' reality in different places. So it was not simple to plan an project in 7 places at the same time, but what truly helped us was the passion and the determination shown by partners and team. So actually, when we are talking about the colonial geographical distinction, it was like more than just a geographic one. It was also rooted in people's lives. We used to see Akka very far and Gaza as if we are talking about another country. Regardless, in fact, traveling through all of historical Palestine takes no more than a day. But they have worked for years to make us believe that we are different, that we are not one people, and we are further apart than we can imagine. So when we talk about difficulties, we mean the difficulties in accessing areas, difficult political condition, sometimes approvals from municipalities and particularly colonial municipalities in 48 lands, a challenge in using public space, harassment from settlers, or difficulty of accessing the exhibition itself, which forced us to use internal spaces instead of public spaces in some areas. And when we are talking about the economic one, we are also talking about taking back the shop owners' faith in public's ability to restore respect for them or for their stores and the value of these old souks, markets. So the project was more similar to a dream, although a difficult one. We needed to double our effort, meetings, and follow up in order to deal with the challenge imposed on the ground, which become obvious as the exhibition approached and become extremely clear when it's opened. So it's difficult to be a part of the construction of an exhibition that you won't be able to view. This is at least what happened to me, because I'm Palestinian with a green identification, and the West Bank identity that prevents me from entering much of Palestine, including 48 lands and Gaza. That means that I wasn't able to go to Akka, Yafa, Jerusalem, Gaza, Nusra, and that's what was not that easy. But we worked hard as good as we can to overcome these difficulties. And the people who assisted us, actually, the most in unifying the Palestinian map with the people themselves, the people of the land, the shop owners. They were shocked when they discovered that they were selling the same goods in Akka and Gaza, Hebron and Nasra. And they used to joke that they do not think that they are currently part of the same exhibition that exists in other 6 cities in Palestine. And then the team and the people thought together that we were at least attempting to imagine one Palestine and many stories of the sons of the land. So I think that's it. But it was great, actually, even though.
Sorry, really bad time management on my part. I apologise. It's very hard to interrupt these presentations, but we do have 10 minutes left. So if anyone has a question that they would like to pose, please do.
If you raise your hand, I'll bring the mic to you.
Or the comment, yeah, or just a comment. Or, yes, please. I know that's pressure on people to.
Hi, I'm Natalie. I'm a bachelor graduate from McGill. I just wanted to thank you for the exhibition and the presentation, and relate back to your talk about photography and how the exhibition and the talk especially were really good as a like permanent mark and memory for McGill and students at McGill, because as much as media and digital media and social media are great for Palestinians to share their stories, sometimes it becomes too fast and too ephemeral for people in the West to understand, and it becomes kind of like a trend that just passes by. And having those images on the wall at McGill and actual people that are in Palestine talking about it is such it's a different scale of sharing these stories. So just want to say thank you for that.
They raised their hand first. Oh, no, no, we're going by that. But I'm coming.
There you go.
Okay, hold on. Hi, is the mic on? No.
Hi, I'm Fatma, undergraduate student at McGill. I wanted to ask because of something you said during your presentation about how the boycotting and the financial pressures that were put on the Israeli economy during the Intifada, the original Intifada, brought on an actual change. I wanted to ask you, how could we, as people outside of Palestine, of people who don't have access to our own lands, how could we help, how can we tangibly help the situation there? Is it just that we boycott Israeli products and we, as SPHR did, put legislation to stop, thank you, to stop universities from funding settler colonies, I guess. Is there anything else we should be doing or we could do, not just financially, but كمان يعني معنويا, meaningfully? Okay, I don't know, learn Arabic. معنويا, to help the people back in Palestine. Thank you, that's my question.
Oh, there.
You want to answer?
No, I mean, I think you're the expert on the diaspora dimension of this.
Well, thanks for the question. I don't really know how to answer. I think there are many ways. Maybe they'll sort of put it that way, right? I think one of the things that's often really frustrating when it comes to any form of activism, and particularly vis-a-vis Palestine, is sometimes the sort of lack of centrality, if I can call it that, which is perhaps a very outcome of what the Palestinian problem has become, right? This kind of spread out, and I think what two of the speakers at least were referring to, you know, that feeling that somehow Akka and Gaza and Nablus are like somehow not part of the same place, and it's surprising when you discover that they are, and they're connected. So I think the first thing is to kind of recognize that there's a plethora of different activities that one can take on, right? So sure, boycotts is one, and I think the boycotts of the Intifada were really different than what we're kind of going through now. But I think boycotts is one. I think actually efforts like this are really wonderful, precisely because of what I think it was Natalie there who said, of ways of sort of bringing things together that are not as ephemeral, right? Of putting things up on the walls, of bringing people together that normally wouldn't be brought together. So even if you can't meet in person, to at least meet over Zoom or whatever it is. So I think there's just many different ways of going about it. Is really all I can kind of tell you right now. Usually I'm really pessimistic, so I'm trying not to be a pessimist tonight.
Hello, my name is Han. I'm a graduate student at the Institute of Islamic Studies, and I'll just start with some comments and I'll ask my question at the end. I think like Professor Helga Tawil-Souri, you really pointed out like the significance of the markets in the colonial gaze and the project of like domination in Eurasia. And I feel like I can connect so much with my own positionality as a Vietnamese person standing in solidarity with Palestine. And I feel like markets always appear, you know, the biggest in colonial maps in different contexts, but they always seem to be shrinking, disappearing, being restructured by the flooding of colonial goods, whether it be, you know, the cotton industry in Mosul, or, you know, in Vietnam, and you know, our indigenous local goods. And these local goods are always destroyed, and even the idea of the markets in colonized societies and in the colonial gaze, you know, markets are always seen as disorderly, chaotic, dirty even, and you know, we have the phrase wet markets as places where, you know, disease and filth proliferate, and it's so present to our context, you know, in the context of COVID, you know, with, you know, the Wuhan market being labeled as dirty, where, you know, the West basically, you know, deployed the, you know, colonial discourses. But I feel like, you know, markets, you know, as you have shown as sites of effective economies, where the politics and poetics of the everyday take place. And it's no surprise that the Arab Spring, you know, in 2010 took place in 2010, and it was sprung ahead by a vegetable seller in Tunis. And I think that, you know, all this together just makes me think about the idea of the Helga, of the movement, not just the physical movement of the people of local goods, but Helga as the political movement building of, you know, not just Palestinians. And even the Souq itself, it's, you know, comes from Sawaqa, which is, you know, to drive, to mobilize. And it's also a drive, you know, in terms of, you know, psychology as, you know, a determined urge to attain a goal, a political goal of, you know, liberation of Palestine. And I have my question. So I'd like to ask you, you know, every panelist, what is the importance of virtual reality in the imagining of, you know, a Palestinian futurism, linking history, the present, to build like, I don't know, some kind of futuristic but also electronic sword for Palestinians in all of occupied Palestine and in the diaspora. Thank you.
all the panelists.
All the panelists. So why has been started? I think, I mean, I don't know much about virtuality or technology. I'm very old school in terms of trying to bring people together. I see virtual reality as another means to which to make Palestinians, bring Palestinians into common spaces, because common spaces are in themselves productive and generative in terms of recognizing the self, in terms of understanding what that self means, not just abstractly, but in terms of these interactions actually producing that self constantly. But in themselves, they're not enough. I think we need to think about how these things serve as means. Photography here also serves as means and not as an end in itself. So far as it helps us imagine a different Palestine, it's very central, but it needs to be connected to a broader political project that is actually working towards liberation and unification. I don't know if that's a good answer. Yeah, that's good.
I mean, I'm happy to say a couple of things. One is, I guess maybe my first reaction would be to also recognize that often digital spaces, right, whether it's virtual reality or photography or media or whatever it is, are also often very much kind of subject to the dynamics of enclosure, right? I mean, they're very much profit-oriented markets. It's all about who's going to own that information, what kind of information are you producing as a user that is then going to be sold, that is then kind of creating other profit motives. So one is to recognize that that drive, if you want, to enclose exists everywhere, right? So it's I don't want to say that it's inescapable, but that there is no space that is necessarily free from that. That's one. The other is to then equally recognize that there are not necessarily ways around it, but that you can sort of burrow holes even within those constraints, right? So I see in certain ways you can look at the physical markets as burrowing holes in those, not just simply sustaining their existence, no matter what's kind of going on around them, but creating different forms of exchanges, creating different forms of socialities and so on. So I think the same can be said in a virtual space, if you want to call it that, right? And again, I think this exhibit and the way that it's been put together by people who are not able to physically meet is precisely an example of how that can happen. So that's kind of, I don't know, a couple of ways to respond. The other way to respond is, yes, of course, there's always that question of, well, how do you make anything that happens in the digital world and the virtual world, kind of, how do you make it kind of, how do you re-territorialize it, right? How does it speak back to the land? And I used to feel very, I'm increasingly confused about how to answer that question, right? And I think it's partially because of the past 2 years. Partially because we've learned, certainly here, to exist in this kind of Zoom world, right? I mean, I feel like, oh, I've seen people. I was just talking to somebody earlier, have I actually ever met you in person? I feel like I know you really well, but maybe I don't remember you physically. So something is different in the sense of how we've learned to relate to each other. So I don't know yet. I feel like we're kind of living in this moment where there is a shift. I can't see where it's going. There is, of course, a danger, right, because of enclosures, because of surveillance, and so on. But I also, again, I find myself super optimistic tonight. I don't know what it is, but I think that there seems to be this weird room for possibility, right? And then in terms of the markets, the one thing that I was going to quickly respond to you is, I think what's also interesting is to often recognize how something of it's almost like fringe markets end up emerging, right? In places like Palestine or in colonial situations. So I think of like checkpoints as these are the markets today. Like you go to the, well, maybe not today as much, but like in the past, I don't know, 10, 20 years, you'd go to the checkpoint And there would be these jokes. Well, it's duty-free zone, right? Because that's where everybody is, and people are selling and buying and so on. And it's the same when you think of tunnels. It's the same when you think of refugee camps. It's the same of, you know, places that are somehow ostracized or excluded from the center, where markets also emerge, right? So it's different, and I'm not saying, oh, that's the way to go about it. Of course, you don't want to lose that heritage, right? The sort of physical, tangible heritage of the old markets. But I think there's also an importance in recognizing that markets are spaces that emerge elsewhere too, that take on different physical form, but that perhaps lead to similar forms of sociality.
Mhm.
I don't know if anyone, Wyatt or Rita or Amir, would you like to add anything? Is that you? No? Okay.
They want to go to sleep.
Yes.
I know. Thank you so much for staying up with us so late. It's been really amazing to have you here. And thank you all for coming and for staying and for your engagement. And please go and visit the exhibition. It'll be on until April 7th. There are going to be other talks and screenings that are going to be held over the course of the next 3 weeks, talking about this idea of markets that are produced at checkpoints. Nasa Abdurrahman has written about this in really interesting ways. He'll be coming and will be coming virtually here. Next week, next Monday, the 28th. I've lost track of time. I don't know what the 28th is like. It's Monday. We'll be talking about his work. So please come to that if you can. We should stop because but yes, and also thank you so much, Helga. Thank you all our amazing panelists and curators. Thank you for all the work you put into this incredible exhibition. And we'll just have to do something else. We have to start planning the next event.
And thank you, Diana, to you for making all of this possible.